So this is a grand experiment. Welcome and thank you. I'm very excited about the three faculty members that we have. I'm very excited about each of their presentations. I think the hardest thing is going to be for each of them to limit themselves to a relatively short presentation. And while they're doing that, we'll have PowerPoints, we'll dim the light for it. And then we're going to try to let the technology sort of get out of the way and have a conversation, an interdisciplinary conversation as far as we can in our limited time together. So there'll be sort of three movements, I think, to the next, not quite hour and a half together. The first will be, you'll hear from them about research in their fields. And then we'll have just a brief conversation among the panel where they respond to one another, maybe ask some questions about one another's research or research focus, or just react. And this is fun. I mean, speaking as a faculty member myself, you know, we're all here because we like to learn. And usually we like to learn across a range of subjects. What happens is we all get very focused, often in disciplinary research, and you know, have to turn on NPR or whatever to hear about topics of such breadth. And this is really a treat because it's an opportunity to hear from colleagues who we're not all in the same departments. We don't bump into one another on campus all that often. We don't get to take classes with one another in the ways that you do. But it's not really about a conversation among the panel. That's just to kind of set the stage, and hopefully the final act in this little play together will be to invite you all into the conversation, to ask questions about anything you heard, to just respond, react to. And you chose this, or at least the first year fellows here. You had an opportunity to look at any number of different topics through an interdisciplinary perspective, and you wanted to learn about disease. So we have three different, very different takes, I think, on disease. And we sort of came up with this framing of changing perceptions of disease. And I think you'll find, if you keep that, that phrase in mind, changing perceptions of disease, that it should sort of resonate across all three presentations. So please let me just introduce our speakers. First, we're going to doubly subvert expectations here. We're going to go in reverse alphabetical order, so that's one. And we're also going to end with antiquity, so that our classic scholar doesn't bear the burden of history. We'll end there. How's that? So we'll hear first from Jennifer Uno, who is assistant professor of biology. She's from Arizona. She went to graduate school there. Go Cats, she says, before heading out to North Carolina to work at UNC. Go Heels. Chapel Hill alumnus myself. We'll have to have a conversation about that. Dark days in Chapel Hill right now. But before coming to Elon, so she ends with that, go Phoenix. She teaches general biology as well as anatomy and physiology. She loves science, and her students will tell you, and some of you may be her students, that she gets excited over any cool biology facts and thinks that the gut is the coolest organ around. So we'll be hearing a little bit about that. Her research focuses on the interactions between immune cells and the microbes that reside in the intestine, and her website has many more details about that. When she's not at Elon, she enjoys spending time outdoors with her husband and their two dogs, and I assume with all of their gut flora as well, right? Okay. Aunchalee Palmquist is assistant professor of sociology and anthropology. She is a medical anthropologist and international board-certified lactation consultant. She received her PhD at the University of Hawaii, Manoa in 2006. Before arriving at Elon, she held a 2-year appointment as postdoctoral associate and lecturer at Yale University Jackson Institute for Global Affairs and Global Health Initiative. She's going to talk to us about a topic that I think you'll find quite timely. In fact, this issue may have been one of the reasons why you as a first-year class voted to examine disease tonight in the first place, and that is, of course, Ebola. But she's going to talk to us about what medical anthropologists have been doing vis-a-vis ongoing Ebola intervention, particularly in West Africa. And finally, Kristina Meinking is assistant professor of classical languages in the Department of World Languages and Cultures. She teaches courses in Latin. She teaches courses in classics. She joined the Elon faculty in the fall of 2010 after completing her PhD at the University of Southern California. Her research interests include late antique religion, politics, and intellectual history. I think we'll probably touch on each of those subjects tonight, again, as well as Latin pedagogy and Roman topography. And she is going to talk about religion as disease. Romans on the spread of early Christianity in the 2nd century CE. So again, we'll go in that order, and I invite Jennifer Uno first, please. Thank you.
So I just want to thank you all for inviting me here tonight to be a part of this special event. It's always an honor and sort of fun to present alongside my fellow faculty friends, which we don't get to do often here at Elon. So let me introduce myself. I already had a lovely introduction. I'll tell you a little bit more. I am Dr. Uno. I teach anatomy and physiology for those of you who don't know. And this is my husband here, and this was our little family unit until a couple of months ago when we added this little fellow into the mix. I knew that would get a collective awe. So Joey really is sort of the inspiration for my talk tonight for a couple reasons. One, because he's been sort of my focus this semester. And also because he sat on my lap for a large portion of the writing of this talk. He's also the reason why I was a little late tonight. So all of those combined, he inspired me. But as a new parent, as a first-time parent, I was sort of inundated with a lot of supplies that are all aimed at keeping this little guy nice and clean and bug-free. Right, so everything from bottle sterilizers to really fancy bottle sterilizers, to all natural antibacterial soaps, and to my ultimate favorite, the immense array of wipes that are available to keep my kid clean, right? Both parts of his body and things that he may touch. And this is all in an effort to keep the microbes and bacteria, I'm guessing, away from him. But as a mom and a scientist, I actually started to question this, right? Because I know that I am the host to millions upon trillions of bacteria that reside in our body, right? So is this all really necessary? That was my question. And so let's talk about these microbes, right? So the microbiota represents a community of friendly and some pathogenic bacteria that reside within the human body. And the truth of the matter is we're more bacterial than we are human. Bacterial cells outnumber human cells by about 10 to 1. That makes it, there are about 100 trillion bacteria out there. This is a very diverse group of bacteria with about 10,000 different species out there. And importantly, if you were to bottle them all up and put them in a jar, they would actually weigh about 2.5 pounds. That's about the weight of a large jar of peanut butter. It's big, right? And so given the fact that we live in harmony with this bacteria, I wondered when we first began to wage war on these microbes. When is it that we became so afraid of germs? And really, I go back to this guy. Does anyone know who this is? Yeah? This is Alexander Fleming, right? And Dr. Fleming in 1928 made an amazing discovery. He discovered penicillin, and it really is the world's first wonder drug. The ability of this drug to inhibit bacterial growth and fight infection was completely altered the course of medicine, really. Our ability to fight infection, right, was a huge advancement in medicine. And it has undoubtedly saved probably millions of lives, maybe I would say, right, since its advent. And since we've learned to mass produce the stuff, and since we've developed more antibiotics, we've sort of developed this love relationship of all things antimicrobial, and this sort of fear-hate relationship with all things bug-like, right? But are they really that bad? Because once again, we coexist with them in our body harmoniously on a day-to-day basis. And so let's take a look at where these bugs in our body reside. Most of them reside in either our skin or our GI tract. You already told that the gut is my favorite organ, so I'm going to stick with that tonight. And we're going to talk about 3 different diseases and how the bugs in our gut influence those diseases. All of these are probably diseases that you've heard of, and we're going to kind of look at how we've changed our perception of those 3 diseases. And the first one is celiac disease. You all probably know someone who cannot eat wheat products, right? Celiac disease is an allergy to wheat proteins. What ends up happening when these individuals eat wheat is it causes a toxic environment in the intestine that actually destroys intestinal cells, right? And we've actually known the cause of celiac disease for about 40, 50 years or so. And so the cure is stop eating wheat, right? Wheat products. It's actually more challenging than you would think. And recent research has indicated that individuals who have celiac disease actually have a different bacterial makeup in their intestines. And in general, they have less of this bacteria, Bifidobacteria. Bifidobacteria is a very common bacteria in your intestine. It's considered a commensal or a friendly bacteria. We like it. It helps with things like digestion. Importantly, it also helps prevent things like apoptosis, which is just a fancy way of saying programmed cell death in the biology world. It also helps stabilize these orange bars in your cells, and those are representative of tight junctions. These are important proteins that help keep your intestine as a barrier. Right, so people with celiac disease have less bifidobacteria, so that makes their intestinal cells more prone to cell death and leaky. So this changes how we look at the disease, right? It's no longer just an allergy to wheat protein, but rather how that allergy interacts with the bacteria that resides in our intestine. But celiac disease is a GI disorder, so it's not too surprising that it's influenced by the microbiota. Let's try a different disease. How about cardiovascular disease? Cardiovascular disease is usually characterized by a narrowing of your arteries, right? So blood can't get through, ultimately leads to things like heart attacks. This graph shows the incidence of death by cardiovascular disease, not morbid at all, right? And you can see the highest rates of death are down here in the South. It's that fried chicken and mac and cheese coming back to haunt us, right? And so interestingly, what studies have found is that there are some bacteria in the intestine, as they metabolize things, create metabolites like this trimethylamine N oxide that can directly lead to plaque buildup in your vessel, those things that make your vessels close, right? So, and as it turns out, individuals that eat a more westernized diet, again, that mac and cheese and fried chicken, burgers and fries, all things good, right? That tends to actually lead to the presence of more of this bacteria, Prevotella. And Prevotella is a bacteria that actually is going to promote the production of this metabolite and then lead to more plaque buildup. But again, this could be somewhat intuitive too, because we've all been taught from a young age that a healthy diet would indicate a healthy heart later on in life. Right? So it's not surprising that the food we put in our mouth can alter the microbiota and then lead to changes physiologically. So let's talk about one other disease, and that's depression and anxiety. So really, depression and anxiety, can the microbes in our gut make us more anxious? I'll get to that in a minute. Some facts and figures. About 40 million adults in this country are afflicted by depression and anxiety. We are more of a depressed nation now than we were about 40 years ago. It leads to about $42 billion of medical costs a year, right? And so can anxiety and depression be influenced by microbial bugs? As it turns out, it can, and it does so through what scientists call the gut-brain axis. And this is a bidirectional communication pathway between your brain, and your intestines. And this may seem a little odd to you, but if you've ever been a little bit nervous and had a little GI distress before that big exam, or when you're gonna get the exam back, probably, right? Or before speaking in front of a group, then you'll realize that this isn't a new concept, right? The idea of GI distress in your brain, that's relatively known. What's new is the idea that microbes can actually influence this communication pathway. And one of the first bacteria that was shown to do this is Lactobacillus. Lactobacillus, like Bifido, is a good guy. It's a good bacteria. And what they showed in Ireland is that if they grow mice germ-free, they grow them up in a bubble, they have no bugs, and they take those germ-free mice and they feed them nothing but a certain strain of Lactobacillus, they have a different stress response. How do we measure the stress response in mice? Well, we actually give them a swim test. Right? And so if you take normal mice that have a normal microbiota and you put them in a beaker, they're going to swim. And they'll swim for about 3 minutes until they get tired, realize there's no way out, and then they just kind of do a little mouse float. They don't drown, they just float, right? If you give a mouse nothing but Lactobacillus, they will swim like this for forever. The scientists actually have to pull them out of the beaker to stop the process. So their response to a stressful situation has changed. And what they found was that with this increased lactobacillus, you have increased cortisol. And cortisol is a known stress hormone, right? In both mice and in humans. And they attribute that to changes in lactobacillus. And so now I've talked to you about 3 different diseases, all in different organs, some far from the gut and some near, and the impact that the microbiota has on them. So, do I think that the microbiota can cure everything? Because the modern media right now will tell you absolutely it can. I don't think it can. What I do think it does is add another piece to the puzzle. It gives us the option to think of the microbiota when we think of alternative therapies and options and things that we should consider when we think about the overall pathology of a disease. So maybe now, as a new mom, I will step back and not be so cautious with the microbial wipes and let my son be exposed to some microbes in the hopes that he is going to develop a diverse microbial body that will serve him well in the future. Thank you. I think I might have. That was great.
So that was really awesome and exciting. I don't think my talk is going to be quite as entertaining in the same way. But I'm really pleased to be here with you this evening to talk to you a little bit about anthropology and Ebola. I want to just preface this talk by saying very humbly that I am not an Ebola expert. And this presentation is not a presentation of my own personal research, but I am going to draw heavily on the work of other anthropologists who have had a strong voice in recent events around Ebola in West Africa, and by doing so, I hope to provide you with some understanding of how anthropologists are involved in the study of Ebola. So this guy here probably doesn't need much introduction. This is Ebola. Ebola is a filovirus named after its filamentous morphology, and it was first described in 1976 in rural Congo, not far from the Ebola River. It is called a zoonotic disease, a virus that has evolved the ability to infect both animals and humans. But the transmission of the virus that we see in West Africa today is passed human to human. A person with clinical symptoms of disease sheds the virus through bodily fluids and secretions, even after death, and contact with infected blood and other bodily fluids of an infected individual, as well as contact with surfaces and materials containing these fluids, may lead to infection as well through broken skin or mucous membranes. The average Ebola virus disease case fatality rate is on average 50%, but the rates have varied in previous outbreaks anywhere between 25% to 95%. And according to United Nations report on Ebola that was released just a couple weeks ago, the current West African outbreak is unprecedented. There have been approximately 13,000 cases and nearly 5,000 reported deaths, which are based on the latest estimates by the World Health Organization, including around 546 healthcare workers. And I remind you that these are just estimated reports. These are only the cases that have been actually reported by the Ministries of Health. So countries with the most intense epidemics includes Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, so West African countries here. Other cases have been reported in Mali, Spain, the United States, Nigeria, and Senegal. The first Ebola virus disease outbreaks occurred in mostly remote villages that were near tropical rainforests, but the most recent outbreak that we see here is involved in urban areas and in rural areas as well. So after an initially very lethargic response to early indications of the seriousness of this outbreak, over the last several months, a variety of resources and expertise have been called upon to attempt to form a comprehensive and global response. And we are familiar with epidemiologists. Those are the scientists who are trained in mapping the origin, etiology, and spread of disease. And we're also familiar with the work of humanitarian relief agencies and healthcare workers in the global responses to emerging infectious diseases. However, you may not have considered the importance of anthropology in the global health response to Ebola. So anthropologists such as Ann Kelly, Barry Hewlett, and Sharon Abramowitz have actually been studying the cultural context of Ebola for the past decade. Their insights into the intersection of culture and humanitarian efforts have been featured in the news, along with rather sensationalized headlines regarding local cultural beliefs of witchcraft and sorcery. The impression, then, is that culture not only has exacerbated the rates of infection, but posed insurmountable threats to containing the disease. Anthropologists argue that the conflation of culture with virulence is a serious misrepresentation of the problem, one that both stigmatizes those dealing with disease, which you can think of as a form of victim blaming, and obscures the fundamental structural factors that perpetuate the disease. In a recent interview, Anne Hewlett noted, quote, "Any situations of infectious contagion are highly social. It's an incredibly intimate process, and anthropology is a science of intimacy, of intimate connections. With Ebola, the points of transmission are through touch, and anthropologist does a lot of work with how people interact with each other in an everyday way," end quote. In a headline posted just today, more news of violence and unrest in a city where health workers, local officials, and journalists raising awareness of Ebola were murdered, including the country's own military occupation, which has now been accused of additional human rights issues. Paul Farmer, a world-renowned anthropologist, physician, and human rights advocate, wrote after a recent visit to Liberia, quote, "There have been incidents of violence linked to fear and stigma. In Liberia, where we were warmly welcomed, my colleagues and I heard that 7 Ebola workers, apparently including 2 local public health officials, had been murdered with machetes in rural Guinea. Their bodies were discovered in the septic tank of a local primary school. 11 years ago, 4 Congolese school teachers engaged in Ebola awareness campaigns were also killed. The complex relationship between contagion, lethality, stigma, and long neglect. For example, most people in rural West Africa have never had access to comprehensive medical care, has yet to be laid out," end quote. Anthropologists' then work is to clarify these complex relationships in their research. In thinking about how the study of culture fits into the Ebola response, I want you to consider a couple of things. The way in which culture is conceptualized has far-reaching implications for the provision of humanitarian aid, the effectiveness of such aid, and people's experiences with death and dying. Culture can be conceptualized as a barrier to be intervened upon and as a fundamental reason for high rates of disease, but culture can also be conceptualized as a resource and a pathway to better understand possible long-term sustainable solutions. Culture also doesn't exist in a vacuum. Culture exists within broader contexts of social structures, including globalization, poverty, inequality, and violence. All of this points to the fact that the Ebola crisis today has a history and one that needs to be recognized in moving forward. So here are some of the key issues for anthropologists working on Ebola now, which I will discuss briefly. The first is this idea of disease virulence, and when people think of Ebola, they think of a really scary, really virulent disease, evidenced by the high rates of infection. But I ask you this question: is the virulence a function of the biology of the virus or the context in which this infection has emerged? Examples of this way of thinking may be found in the way that Ebola virulence has been perceived, particularly in the US. We have had, a handful of cases here, and people are freaking out about it. 5,000 people have died in West Africa, and until maybe 9 months after the first outbreak was reported, nobody here cared. Virulence is highly dependent on the cultural context in which it is found, including the strong health infrastructure to contain, treat, and further prevent infections, the political and economic infrastructure to deliver health services and health education, and the relative health of a population, including nutritional status and pre-existing conditions, all come into play. So the virulence of disease is relative. And what anthropologists studying the Ebola epidemics in Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia have shown us is that the origins of this horrific outbreak may be found in reasons beyond exotic cultural beliefs. Anthropologists do not take behavior for granted. They look at social interactions and ask, why are people behaving in this way? What are the explanations for what we see? One key mission for anthropologists is to help doctors understand how a local population perceives disease. Regarding the origins of stigma surrounding healthcare workers and the fear of Ebola, Ann Kelly has noted, quote, "These people have lived with and around animals for generations, but have never seen this kind of disease. Thus, the epidemic becomes linked instead to practices never seen before or out of context, such as disinfecting houses, erecting barriers, taking relatives out of the hospital from where they do not return. Disease becomes then a logical extension of the efforts of government officials and foreigners, she writes, and anthropologists can help bridge that gap. Forced relocation and quarantine of entire villages in a context where political violence and distrust of local authorities also leads to this perception that health workers are the source of disease and not a resource for treatment and prevention. Another anthropologist writes about his experience studying Ebola 10 years ago in Uganda. He writes, "The local people thought that the Europeans in control of isolation units were in the body parts business. Their loved ones would go into the isolation units and they would never see them come out. Because of the high mortality rate, virtually everybody from Ebola died. To further prevent spread of disease, medical workers would zip the bodies up in a bag, and healthcare workers would not always notify relatives of a death because of the need to dispose of the body quickly. The anger and bad feelings about not being informed were directed towards the healthcare workers in the isolation unit. And this fear could have been averted by allowing family members to see the body in the bag and allowing family members to escort the body to a burial ground. Today, efforts to contain such outbreaks must be culturally sensitive and appropriate," he says. "Otherwise, people are running away from actual care that is intended to help them." This is another quote from Aunchalee in a recent NPR story. "To contain this epidemic, we must come to grips with the dynamics of fear and obligations of care in a context where everyone is afraid. This means seeing populations not as a stumbling block to halting the spread, but as our only resource." Anthropologists play an important role in unpacking the risk concept, which changes perceptions of disease. They examine how risk is socially constructed and how these social constructions influence health. Anthropologists are particularly aware of the unequal distribution of disease and disparities in access to care. In many of these West African countries, pregnant women, infants, and children are the most vulnerable to the disease and are dying at disproportionate rates. There is no known case of a pregnant woman who's been infected with Ebola that hasn't died, or an infant who's been infected with Ebola who hasn't died. Caregiving during a person's illness and following their death, a responsibility carried primarily by women, means that they are likely to come into contact with these diseases at higher rates. And pictured here is a photograph of a woman who lost her 10-year-old daughter to Ebola, who herself was infected but survived and was breastfeeding her two twins at the time her other daughter was infected with Ebola. So this is a picture here of a survivor family. Thousands of people with Ebola have died in isolation, afraid, suffering alone in their homes. When health is treated as a basic human right, and it's not always treated that way, not even in the United States, by the way, this translates into the right to have compassionate care while sick and dying. Anthropologists have shown that local people are desperate for interventions that enable families to care for their dying loved ones and safely exercise important funerary and burial rituals in a dignified manner, and these priorities have been lost in many of the humanitarian aid efforts. In their research, anthropologists have described the ways in which Ebola survivors have been stigmatized and ostracized in their communities due to fear. Understanding how people find resilience to Ebola through survivorship may help identify innovative programs for education, care, and prevention. And this is one of my favorite Paul Farmer quotes. "Ebola isn't a natural disaster. This is a terrorism of poverty." Anthropologists gather evidence to provide insights into the complexities of disease. And Paul Farmer writes, "Here's my assertion as an infectious disease specialist. If patients are promptly diagnosed and receive aggressive supportive care, including fluid, resuscitation, electrolyte replacement, and blood products, very, very simple things, the great majority, as many as 90% should survive. An Ebola diagnosis need not be a death sentence." He's a co-founder of, Paul Farmer is a co-founder of Partners in Health, and what they have recommended in kind of an easy to remember phrase is that we need staff, stuff, systems, and space to help prevent the spread of Ebola. And this essentially means involving people on the ground, building communities, building a healthy health infrastructure in places where there hasn't been one. And if anything, this whole outbreak has really put a spotlight on the fact that we, as globalized and developed nations, have really ignored the poverty and the lack of infrastructure in these West African countries. And it's not just a West African disease. That's the beauty of globalization. The idea that some lives matter less is the root of all that's wrong with the world. So I will leave you with that.
So good evening, and thank you again. Thank you, panelists, for having me as one of you this evening and for bringing a little bit of the ancient world into a very modern and timely discussion, as it were. As a classicist, I really like words and I really like language. So you might have seen in the description that you had for this talk, I included the words religio and superstitio and contagium, which all come from Latin and come pretty directly into English, which is exciting, of course. So I'm going to be referring to a little bit of that this evening, and I wanted also to broaden the context of the discussion for the ancient world. And there is a PowerPoint somewhere. I might study the ancient world, but I can put together a PowerPoint. Not as glamorously, but it can be there. Thank you. While that's
No.
not my child. I do have 2 dogs, though. So while that's all getting set up, and thank you guys, I wanted to give you a sort of framing question for our consideration of religion as disease. And that really is a thing I'd like for you to think about as we talk about these things this evening, is how the language of the disease, if the language of disease conveys cultural perspectives. So what are we really talking about when someone or something is ill or sick or diseased or not right? And one way to get us thinking about that is, how do we know? How do you know when somebody is not healthy, when somebody is sick or ill in some capacity? Open question. I'm going to ask a lot of questions, so yes.
Start behaving in a manner that's not like they normally do. Like if someone's very active, they become very tired very easily, or they like show symptoms or something.
Mm-hmm. So there's a behavioral change, maybe in their attitude, in their activity level. Maybe something isn't feeling quite right. You notice it, right? It's something behavioral, physical, most often, not always. I don't want to talk in categorical terms. So one way of thinking about that for the ancient world is thinking not just about a person, him or herself, who is sick or diseased or ill, but the state itself as a sort of body politic, the state as something that is conceived of as having different parts, some of which, well, really all of which need to work in concert, just like the human body does, to function appropriately and to keep running. And this is an idea that comes up again and again, the burden of history, throughout time, but it is one very prevalent in the ancient world. And the Romans, of course, believed it as well. They thought of the Roman state through its various iterations as a unit, as a body. All of it had to be functioning well, and it had a very close relationship to the divine world. So the image you have up here is a Bernini statue from about 1619 depicting the hero of Troy, if Troy could have a hero, Aeneas, fleeing Troy to eventually found the line that would found Rome itself and then the Roman Empire. And here he has his little son with him, which is nice, and he's also carrying his elderly father Anchises out of the ashes of Troy. And you can see up there these 2 little dudes hanging out that Anchises is actually carrying on Aeneas' head. How he fled with all of that going on remains unknown, but he's carrying something called the Lares and the Penates, the private gods of the home, but also the gods of the city itself. So in fleeing Troy to go and found, eventually, the city of Rome, they are taking home with them the symbol of Rome in the form of the gods, the symbol of Troy, rather, in the form of the gods. So Rome is founded in 753 BCE, a long, long time ago, and it has this very close relationship to Troy. And the even in that statue and in the story of Aeneas's journey to Italy, which is in Virgil's epic, the Aeneid, you see this relationship between the integrity, the health of the private sphere and the health of the public sphere. And very much, something that's very much a part of that is the relationship, the health of both of those entities to the gods. And we see in the first book of the Aeneid, Jupiter says to Aeneas, well, actually he says it to Venus, Aeneas's mother, I give to the Romans no end whatsoever, no limits of their power, no tempora. Tempora is the word for time, so there's no time limit. They have all eternity. He's making them immortal. And I give them empire without end, imperium sine fine. So there are a number of ways in which we could talk about this quotation, but I'd like for you to think about it now in terms of the relationship or the conceptual relationship of Rome as a politic, as a body politic, as a state to the divine sphere as well. So religio, our religion, is very much a part of the smooth running of the state, and it's very much geared toward the pax deorum, the peace of the gods. This involves a number of rituals, a number of magistracies, the taking of omens by augurs, so you had priests who would look at entrails, which I wouldn't recommend, and also maybe Jennifer would know. So entrails and also the flights of birds through the skies. I mean, there are various ways of corresponding with the divine and trying to understand their will and keep them happy. What you did not want, what you wanted to avoid at all costs, was the anger of the gods, the ira deorum, which is a lot of fun to think about. That's a whole nother talk. So you had a number, again, of magistracies, priesthoods, the eventual foundation of an imperial cult, a cult to worship the divine spirit of the emperor himself and his family, that evolves throughout the course of the history of Rome. So again, we're talking very beginning, 753 BCE, long, long time ago, through where we're going to go today, which is about the 2nd century CE, so about 1,000 years, give or take. So religio comes to stand in opposition to something the Romans called superstitio, from which we get our English word. Yes, excellent, you're all still awake. So religio and superstitio have these very opposite meanings. Religio, we think it's disputed, but we think mostly, and Christians used it in this way, it comes from the sense of being bound to bind fast to someone or something else. So religio is described often in these terms. You are binding yourself. It is a relationship to a divinity in this context. It's this conscientious observation of what is right, of doing your duty, of moral obligation, this very well-packaged sort of way of interacting with the divine. On the other hand, you have superstitio, which is also disputed etymologically, but most people think that it comes from a combination of this preposition super and a verb stare, to stand. So superstitio, to stand over, perhaps comes from the sense of standing over something in awe of it. And you're in awe of it because you really don't understand it. Religio is packaged, it's understood, there are processes for dealing with it and practicing it. Superstitio is the things with which we would associate magic, cult, things that aren't familiar in a sort of comforting way. And it, again, includes a sense of the dread of the supernatural. It's very fearful, this credulous wonder, this anxiety, not really knowing. So they're two very opposite ideas. We can reframe this a little bit as a question about orthodoxy and heterodoxy. So the Romans were very comfortable with their own gods, which were sort of hybrid of native Italic deities and Greek divinities. So, I mean, whether they were actually Roman or not is up for dispute. But they were very happy with what they had, and they were very comfortable with importing other gods on their own terms. There's a story that the oracle told them to go fetch the god Asclepius from Epidaurus, and Asclepius happily left his home in Epidaurus and made his way to the island on the Tiber, where there is still a hospital, because Asclepius was the god of healing. So they're very comfortable importing other gods on their own terms, and they're very comfortable with religions that have existed for some time. Judaism, for example, had been around long before the Romans were, or before there was anything like Christianity. And they're okay with it. They call it a religio licita. It's allowed, as opposed to something that's illicit. Religio also included these rituals that I've mentioned, right? Or the idea of rituals. So this orthodoxy, this straight way, this correct way of believing, as opposed to things that were superstitio, that were heterodox. So things that were unlike, they were sort of the opposite of orthodox. Part of the concern with this juxtaposition between, or opposition between religio and superstitio on the one hand, orthodoxy and heterodoxy on the other hand, is that anyone who was involved in superstitio, because it was unknown to those practicing religio, to those sort of within the mainstream, were immediately othered, and it had to be political. So this is going back to what I said a few minutes ago about religion and politics being very much intertwined in the ancient world, and specifically the ancient Roman world. So those who were charged or accused of practicing superstitio were also accused of practicing seditio, from which we get the word sedition. Does anybody know what sedition is? Want to take a stab at it? Any guesses? Someone. You don't have to give me the Latin, you can just tell me the English. Please enlighten us. All right. So sedition is you can think of it as the political form of superstitio in the modern and the ancient worlds, right? Sedition is a stirring up, a going away from the mainstream. And there are various ways, again, that we could talk about it. But in Latin, seditio, this going apart, this going away. So if you were practicing, engaged in a behavior that could be labeled as superstitio, you were going away, again, from something that conformed and that had both religious and political implications, which is what's scary to the Romans. So this takes us to the first passage that's on your handout. Again, classicists, big on the handouts, big on having you see what I'm talking about in front of you. I underlined some of the most important parts, but that first passage is from the historian Livy, who's writing in the 1st century BCE, so a long time ago. And he's writing about, in this passage, something called the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, which was an ultimate decree of the Senate against anybody worshiping the god Bacchus. What was the god Bacchus, or Dionysus in his Greek formation, the god of? Right, everybody knew that one. Come on, sedition, Dionysus. Know your audience, Meinking. All right, so these decrees, the ultimate decree of the Senate against those participating in these rites and festivals for various reasons, and Livy lists a number of charges. The incident he's referring to happened in the 2nd century BCE in the year 186, and it seems to be the case that people are running amok, everybody's having sex, everybody's drinking, people are eating their babies, which is a really good way of accusing people of superstitio, actually, in the ancient world, and not inapplicable to the modern world. So everybody's running amok, and the Senate says, enough of this, we're getting rid of you. And this is the language that they use. This is number 9, or passage 9 there. The infection of this mischief, like that from the contagion of disease, spread from Etruria to Rome, et cetera, et cetera. So there you see immediately, right, this rhetoric of disease used to talk about something that's maybe not understood, with which the Romans are maybe not comfortable, that has to be separated out religiously, politically, socially, culturally. So that's Livy writing in the late 1st century BCE about something that happened 200 years earlier. Pliny, the younger, who witnessed the eruption of Mount Vesuvius while his uncle died trying to observe it, was the governor of Pontus in Bithynia, which is now modern-day Turkey, and he used to write the Emperor Trajan all the time. So Pliny lived from about 61 to 112 CE, so about 150 years after Livy, and the Emperor Trajan ruled from 98 to 117 CE. So they're rough contemporaries, and Trajan was the emperor while Pliny was governor in this province, which is up in the Black Sea. People got exiled there. It's not really where you wanted to be. Pliny was not really happy about being there, and he would write Trajan all the time. There's a mouse in my house, what do I do? And Trajan would respond, kill it, or whatever. But some of the correspondence does move down to that level. But this document in particular, in the 10th book of his epistles, this exchange, this whole thing is on your handout, letters 96 and 97, is the first instance, for example, of the name Christian used to describe what we now refer to as early Christians. So first instance of it, which is really exciting. 112 CE, long time after the death of Jesus, just a sort of side note there. And early Christianity is another very long conversation, but Pliny has a problem. There are these people running around calling themselves Christians, and their belief, and this is on this back side of the handout, and it's the part on the screen, their belief has spread everywhere, right? And this is why he's writing Trajan, especially because of the number involved. For many persons of every age, every rank, and also of both sexes are and will be endangered, right? It's immediate alert. There's a fear word. Trajan, get this on your radar. For the contagion of the superstition has spread not only to the cities, but also to the villages and farms, but it seems possible to check and to cure it. It's really interesting, it seems to me, and hopefully to at least some of you, that we're talking about, that Pliny is rehearsing this language that Livy uses, that many other people use, that we still use to talk about people, yes, but people who are infected with something other than a biological, physical disease, right? It is a disease of an entirely different sort. And this sort of structuralist dichotomy between religio and superstitio, orthodoxy and heterodoxy, morally right, morally wrong, healthy on one hand, sick and diseased on the other, is a rhetoric that gets employed again and again and again. Originally, I thought I was the first person, and I was going to tell you to keep an ear out for hearing that sort of language in the topics that my colleagues were discussing this evening. And you also might go back through this Pliny letter and think about how he talks about his experience dealing with Christians and deciding what to do with them in sort of diagnostic terms, right? So there are these three kinds, they do this or they don't do this. If they do this, then I treat them this way. So the entire letter could be read from a more medical perspective if one wanted to. So I leave you with that thought, this idea of diagnosis of disease, ultimately what we might see as Pliny's concern in this letter, and how, most importantly perhaps, as we continue these conversations this evening, we might think about this rhetoric as used in contemporary society, politics, religion, everything. So, thank you.